Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 528, Bakumatsu, Part 1. The year was 1851, and President Millard Fillmore of the United States had a problem. Well, honestly, he had quite a few problems. In addition to having what I think it is fair to say is the most objectively ridiculous name in the history of the American presidency, Millard, President Fillmore had inherited a country deeply divided. The question of slavery had profoundly split American society, with increasingly violent clashes between pro- and anti-slavery groups over the future of an institution that, in retrospect, represented one of the most profound stains on America's moral legacy in its history. Fillmore's own party, the Whigs, was deeply split along the issue as well. And so President Fillmore decided to take a courageous moral stance and tackle the issue head-on in the name of moral rectitude and standing up for what is right. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, he decided to pursue an overseas foreign policy adventure to hopefully distract the American people with a big win and get them to forget all of this slavery nonsense. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way. Fillmore would lose his party's own presidential primary before this planned expedition got where it was supposed to go, and his own Whig party would implode over divisions on slavery shortly thereafter, with a more radical anti-slavery faction, including a young Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, going on to found a new party that called itself Republican. Far more important than the rationale behind this poorly considered overseas adventure was its result. Fillmore's chosen adventure was an expedition to forcibly open Japan to America's trade, and his Secretary of State Daniel Webster ended up settling on an American naval officer and hero of the recent Mexican-American War to lead this planned overseas expedition, Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry. Now, in a certain sense, the Perry expedition honestly wasn't that big of a shift in approach from previous attempts by outside powers to forcibly open Japan. Starting in the 1790s with the expedition of the Russian-backed Adam Laxman, there had been a series of attempts by powers from the West other than the Dutch to get Japan to open up more ports to external trade. For the United States specifically, attempts to open Japan up, primarily as a resupply port for its whaling fleets in the Pacific, dated back to 1837, when the China-based American businessman Charles King chartered a vessel called the Morrison to try and return 3 Japanese castaways who'd been shipwrecked back home, hoping in the offing to open negotiations on trade rights. The Morrison was driven away by force, after the Phaeton incident we discussed a few weeks ago when a British warship entered Nagasaki illegally in 1808. The Tokugawa Bakufu had doubled down on a policy of firing on any foreign ship that attempted to enter its waters. However, after the Morrison, news would arrive from overseas which would force a change to this hardline policy. Specifically, in 1842, word arrived in Edo of the First Opium War, when China's Qing dynasty, the mightiest power in Asia, was humbled handily by forces from the United Kingdom. The defeat, the harsh peace terms, including the seizure of Hong Kong, and most of all the sheer ease with which the British had managed it, 69 combat deaths, a few hundred more killed in captivity, and a few hundred injured versus the near total annihilation of China's fleet, made it very clear that something had changed in the balance of global politics. That something, of course, was the Industrial Revolution, which by the 1840s was about half a century into full swing. A full discussion of the Industrial Revolution and the changes it wrought in Europe is well beyond what we have room to get into in this episode, Indeed, the academic conversation on why the Industrial Revolution began when and where it did is probably one of the most contentious scholarly topics out there today. The upshot, however, is that European and American militaries now had a decisive advantage over their East Asian counterparts, guns that could fire further and faster than anything that had come before, particularly when it came to artillery, ironclad warships that older wooden designs simply couldn't touch. Then there was steam power used to drive both ships and power factories, which could churn out industrial goods cheaper than any handcraft, and thus undercut them on price. And of course, those same factories could pump out the tools of war at an astonishing pace. Somehow, from a historical perspective, fairly short span of time, the armies and economies of Asia had been left in the dust. That realization and the knowledge of what it meant is why Commodore Perry's expedition got a very different reception from the Morrison one. You see, the Bakufu, getting word of these events through its overseas connections, which we have also discussed in past episodes, would end up rescinding the fire-on-site order, but maintaining seclusion as an official policy. How to do that with such a dramatic shift in the military situation, well, nobody quite knew. One gets the sense, looking at these decades, that everyone was aware of an impending crisis in foreign affairs. Indeed, that very crisis was discussed constantly in period sources. One of the most famous intellectuals of this period, the Confucian scholar Aizawa Seishisai, wrote his magnum opus, the Shinron or New Theses, on the danger of the foreign threat, which he saw as a continuation of a multi-century Christian conspiracy to control Japan. There were plenty more calls to action, so to speak. In 1846, the Americans had returned again in the form of Captain James Biddle, who brought 2 American warships to Edo and asked for an audience to work out a trade deal. He was ultimately rebuffed, but only because Biddle didn't have explicit authorization to use force to make things happen at gunpoint if the Japanese wouldn't talk. Authorization he recommended his successor be issued, and which Commodore Perry did get. And yet, despite this very clear and present danger, the Bakufu was never able to articulate a plan. Why not, you ask? Personally, I think it's pretty clearly an issue of leadership. As we've already established, the problem with leadership being an inherited job is that there's no guarantee the person inheriting the job is the one you want doing it. The shogunate itself was not exempt from that issue, and frankly had an awful span of luck in the game of leadership roulette. The 11th and longest reigning shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty, Ienari, ruled the country for 40 years from 1787 to 1837, and is mostly remembered over that long tenure for the number and quality of his personal scandals, including several involving the women of his harem. Even after his official retirement in 1837, Ienari continued to run things from behind the scenes until his death in 1841, at which point his second son, Ieyoshi, took office, the first son having already died of illness. Ieyoshi's actual reign is mostly known for a series of attempted reforms pushed not by Ieyoshi himself, who frankly doesn't seem to have cared about administration that much, but by his counselors. All of those reforms ultimately failed from some combination of impracticality, being very focused on Confucian ethics but not on economic policy, or just being unpopular decisions. Tokugawa Ieyoshi was also literally on his deathbed on July 8, 1853, when Commodore Perry and his American squadron finally arrived in Edo. He would die a few weeks later, right in the middle of the resulting negotiations, substantially complicating the whole issue while a replacement shogun was picked. That replacement, Ieyoshi's son, Iesada, was of poor health and would only make it 5 years before dying in 1858, likely of a cholera pandemic brought to Japan by foreign trade. So none of that's great, obviously, but it's not an insurmountable issue either. This is why the shogun had advisors, the Wakadoshiori and the Roju, the junior and senior counselors, responsible for helping to make decisions. And really, as time went on and the shogun became less actively involved in leadership, these counselors who helped the shogun make decisions really became the ones making decisions for the shogun. And in particular, one of these elders, the Tairo, or senior elder, would take on a leadership role and generally be the one who actually ran the Tokugawa Bakufu. In 1853, that Tairo was named Abe Masahiro, a Fudai daimyo of Fukuyama Domain in what's now Hiroshima and Okayama prefectures. And so it was Abe Masahiro who had to confront the imperious Perry, who by this time did have authorization to use force, and who carried with him a letter from President Fillmore, which he insisted had to be personally delivered directly to the Emperor of Japan. And by this, Perry did mean the shogun. The existence of the symbolic emperor in Kyoto and his role in relation to the shogun was not really clear to Perry or really any other Westerner by this point. The letter which President Fillmore addressed to the shogun insisted that the American president bore, quote, the kindest feelings toward your majesty's person and the government, unquote, and that the American people wished for nothing but friendship and open commerce. However, the letter also contained no shortage of thinly veiled threats, including bragging about the immense wealth of the United States, which could be, of course, directed to the subjugation of an ungrateful Japan, as well as the ever-shortening travel time between the two countries, only 18 days by steamship from the coast of California to Edo. The letter also offered up gifts, quote, of no great value, which were intended to impress upon the Japanese the technological superiority of the United States. These included, among other things, a fully functional miniaturized railroad, as well as a working telegraph with 3 miles of cable. The goal of these gifts was, of course, to use the guise of generosity to present one more threat to the Japanese by demonstrating just how technologically superior the United States was. Perry was eventually convinced to leave the letter with Abe Masahiro's underlings, and after much fanfare, including a swing by one of the fortified coastal batteries outside Edo, where Perry dropped off a white flag telling the defenders if he didn't get what he wanted, they would need it, he left. He promised to return to Japan the following year to conclude an actual treaty with the country once the leadership had had time to consider the offer. He also fired a bunch of blanks from the cannons of his flagship, the Susquehanna, while anchored outside Edo. Perry claimed this was a celebration of Independence Day in the United States, but you'll note he didn't arrive in Japan until 4 days after the 4th of July. Again, the message is pretty clear here. Perry's departure triggered a storm of debate in Edo Castle. Nobody was quite sure what to do. On the one hand, there wasn't really anyone in the leadership under any illusions after the fate of the Chinese in the First Opium War that the shogunate was in a serious position to make a fight of this. On the other hand, giving up meant giving up on the closed country policy, a cornerstone of the shogunate, not to mention the whole thing would be deeply humiliating from a political perspective. And here, Abe Masahiro, unsure of what to do, took an unprecedented and fateful step. He reached out to the daimyo, all of them, including the Tozama outsiders, and asked for their advice. This was a massive breach of established practice. The shogun rarely asked directly for advice except from the most senior long-standing Tokugawa vassals, and certainly didn't ask every daimyo in the country to weigh in. The responses were also very divided, and thus one imagines not very helpful. 61 letters of advice survived the fall of the shogunate, of which 19 supported accepting the American demands, another 19 were opposed, and the remainder temporized and didn't really offer an answer either way. Which, again, is about as unhelpful as it's possible to be, but in the end it wasn't like there really was a choice. Perry would return to Japan after only 9 months, not a year, because he'd heard the Russians were mounting a similar expedition and wanted to get his treaty done first, and when he came, the shogunate gave him what he wanted. The resulting Treaty of Kanagawa opened up 2 Japanese ports to American trade, Shimoda on the Izu Peninsula and Hakodate up in Hokkaido. In the aftermath, other Western powers seized the provided opening and forced their own treaties on Japan, opening it to their commerce. As for Perry himself, he would make it home to America in 1855 and would never return to Asia for the rest of his life, dying just 3 years later. The treaties forced on Japan as a result of the Perry expedition all followed a basic template. They demanded treaty ports which were open to Western trade, and within which Western powers operated with impunity. The basic model here was imported from China, where a similar pattern of imperial exploitation was already well underway. The 19th century, it's important to remember, was the age of informal imperialism in Asia. European powers generally found the idea of conquest in Asia to be too expensive, notwithstanding already existing colonies like the Dutch East Indies or British-ruled India, and so focused instead on extracting economic concessions. Simply put, the core idea of this informal imperialism was to create a structure which would produce all the benefits of traditional empire in terms of the economy for its overlords, without any of the expensive overhead of conquering and holding land. From 1854 to 1868, Japan was forced to sign 11 different unequal treaties with various European powers, as well as the United States, all of which took advantage of Japan's weak geopolitical position to force these humiliating concessions, opening the country to foreign residents and commerce, and offering special treatment for the foreign powers. We're not going to go through all of these unequal treaties, except to say that the usual suspects show up here: France, the UK, Imperial Russia, and some less likely names. Prussia, soon to be the ruler of a united Germany, the Dutch, given their history in Japan, and even Austria-Hungary got in on the action too. However, there's one other unequal treaty we really do have to talk about, the second one signed between Japan and the United States, known unofficially as the US-Japan Treaty of Amity and Commerce, but more commonly after its lead American negotiator as the Harris Treaty. Townsend Harris was the first American consul general sent to Japan. Harris set up shop in Shimoda, one of those two treaty ports opened up by Commodore Perry. It was in a pretty remote location off on the Izu Peninsula, but at least closer to Edo than remote Hakodate. Harris had been interested in coming to Japan for a while. He'd actually been in Shanghai when Perry's squadron had come through the area and tried to convince Perry to let him tag along as a negotiator because he'd been a minor politician and businessman before and had some experience with this kind of thing. Perry refused, and Harris decided to write back home and rely on his diplomatic connections to get an appointed gig in Japan instead. Now, Townsend Harris's tenure in Japan is, honestly, I can't think of a better adjective than complicated. He was very invested in the notion that he knew how to do diplomacy right, which is to say in the Western style, better than the Japanese, and so started things off after renting out a local temple in Shimoda as his consulate. That temple is Gyosenji if you ever go visit, by triggering an 18-month standoff with the shogunate. What issue could possibly be so important as to make an 18th-month standoff worthwhile? Well, Harris had yet another letter from the president, Franklin Pierce this time, and insisted he could only deliver it personally to the shogun. While even Commodore Perry had caved on this specific demand eventually, Harris would not, and after a year and a half did eventually get his way. What was in that letter, you ask? Well, a note from the president saying, quote, "It has occurred to me that the existing treaty between the United States and Japan might be so amended as to secure greater facilities for the exchange of the rich and varied productions of your Majesty's vast empire for those of the United States." In other words, we're not satisfied with what we have, we want an expansion of the unequal treaty and even more trade rights. Harris set about negotiating this new treaty, and the deal he would strike would prove instrumental in reshaping the unequal treaties themselves. Harris was able to bully substantially more concessions out of the Japanese than Perry had been able to, primarily because of veiled threats that if they didn't cut a deal with him, another power like the British would come in and force a way more onerous treaty on the Japanese. Given that as Harris was negotiating all this, China was once again in the middle of losing a war to Britain and France, the Second Opium War this time, it wasn't an empty threat. The final deal expanded the number of treaty ports to 6. Niigata City on the Japan Sea coast would be opened immediately, as would the area of Kanagawa just south of Edo. This is the origin of the modern city of Yokohama, and it represented a huge get for Harris. Perry had not been able to get a treaty port that close to the shogun's capital city. Shimoda was 190 kilometers or 118 miles from Edo. Harris now had 137 kilometers or 23 miles away from the shogun's palace. And if that wasn't enough, 2 more ports were slated to open down the line: Nagasaki in 1861 and Hyogo, right next to Osaka, in 1863. In addition, Harris got an agreement not just for trade rights, but permanent residence for foreigners within the boundary of the treaty ports, a massive shift from past policies. Even the Dutch had been forced to rotate the crew of merchants in Nagasaki to make sure nobody stayed too long, and thus got too familiar with Japan or its defenses. The residents of these ports could also freely practice their religion, the evil faith, from the perspective of the Bakufu, of Christianity. And if that wasn't enough, the treaty also secured limits on tariffs placed on American goods. Tariffs, as we all know from our deep knowledge of economic policy, represent in essence an extra tax on foreign goods designed to make domestic ones cheaper. Limiting Japan's ability to place tariffs on American goods was designed to make it harder for Japanese industries to compete with a flood of cheap industrial goods from overseas. The treaty also included extraterritorial clauses exempting Americans from Japanese law so that they only had to engage with American law while residing in the country, and as the final cherry on top, had something called most favored nation status, which every future and equal treaty would also include. Basically, this is a promise that if in the future any other country secures a better deal with Japan, that deal also retroactively applies to the United States. Which might not seem like a lot on its face, but essentially made it impossible for the shogunate to make use of what otherwise might have been an obvious strategy: to pit the interests of the competing foreign powers against each other by offering favorable deals to some in exchange for technological, military, or economic aid. The Harris Treaty would become the template for all future unequal treaties. The man himself would leave Japan in 1861 thanks to both a turnover in administrations and his own substantial battles with alcoholism, making it harder to do his job, but his legacy would reshape the country. And before we move on from Harris, I do also feel compelled to note that these days he's also very well known for demanding from the Japanese and getting from them sex workers to reside in his home while the negotiations were going on. All of them were teenagers, and, well, the ease with which that demand was met by the Bakufu says a lot about the nature of gender roles in Tokugawa society and about the exoticization of Asian women in the eyes of white men. In addition to that very problematic legacy, Harris's treaty would also prove to be a lightning rod for controversy in its own right. The Treaty of Kanagawa was one thing, but the sheer number of concessions Harris had been able to bully out of the Bakufu using the threat of force was quite another, particularly since most of the other imperial powers of the West were quick to follow suit and extract similar treaties, and since the most favored nation clauses ensured walking back those concessions was going to be really hard to do. Promising to open Hyogo in particular was very controversial. Harris wanted the port because of its proximity to Osaka and because it was in central Honshu. None of the other ports were anywhere close, and thus Hyogo would offer a way to tap into a thus far unexploited market. But Hyogo was also very close to Kyoto, and for a growing number of people that was very concerning. Of course, for the shogunate, protecting the imperial throne from political interference was very important. The 121st emperor, Koumei, was a figurehead, but a useful and important one, and it wouldn't do for his mind to be disturbed by foreign presence. That was particularly important because Koumei himself was known to be quite xenophobically anti-foreign, and generally opposed to signing any treaties with outside powers. For others, protecting the emperor from foreign influence had an even more profound meaning. The Tokugawa peace had seen a flourishing of many arts, not the least of which were history and philosophy, and one branch of thinking that blended the two had come to posit the emperor himself was basically the font of Japanese culture. This movement is called Kokugaku, or National Studies, and had grown steadily over the course of the Edo years. A full recounting of the history of Kokugaku is beyond us here. Simply put, the movement represented an attempt to understand what was distinctive or unique about Japanese culture, and it located the source of that distinctive uniqueness in the remote past, and particularly in elements of Japanese culture and history which could be distinguished and separated from Chinese influence. Kokugaku scholars were among the first to seriously study classical Japanese poetry and literature, and their influence is still felt today. The term mono no aware, or the impermanence of things, which I use to discuss Heian period literature, was coined by a Kokugaku scholar named Motori Norinaga in the 1700s. Kokugaku adherents would eventually turn their eyes towards Japan's mytho-history like the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, the oldest written accounts of Japan's origins, which are pretty unreliable for most of what they cover, but which, given that they are all there is, were treated very seriously by Kokugaku adherents. Since those histories were written to lend the imperial throne luster and legitimacy, Kokugaku as a philosophy ended up focused very much on the idea that the emperor and imperial throne represented the fundamental core of Japanese identity. It was through the emperor that everyone was linked to the gods, given the divine lineage of the imperial family from Amaterasu, and thus the throne made Japan what it was. Kokugaku is probably the best known source of this growing concern for the nature and fate of the imperial throne, particularly because some of its later scholars acted more like religious leaders proselytizing a Shinto revival than anything else, but it's not the only one. For example, in Mito domain in northern Honshu, ruled by a branch of the Tokugawa family, a growing school of Mitogaku, or Mito studies, emphasized a Neo-Confucian reading of Japan's history, which privileged the imperial throne as the font of moral authority and the center of Japan's national character. For adherents of these philosophies, accepting a foreign presence, composed no less of adherents to the evil religion of Christianity, who were in Japan for profit, the lowest of all motives by any Confucian standard, was untenable. By this time, the Tairo Abe Masahiro had been replaced by another man, Hotta Masayoshi, who probably expected some pushback when he approved the treaty's controversial provisions and encouraged the sickly shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu to sign. But I don't think he anticipated the volume of pushback and public condemnation against the terms of the treaty when they became public. And perhaps that's why Hotta then made what I think it is fair to call in retrospect a huge political miscalculation. In the spring of 1858, as the treaty was coming together, he decided that to head off criticisms of the terms of the Harris Treaty, and the opening of Hyogo in particular, he would reach out to Emperor Komei and request his approval of the treaty terms. He was pushed to do this by some of the other elders of the shogun's council, who were afraid to sign something so controversial without imperial approval. Which makes the choice understandable, I guess, but frankly I would still call this a huge political miscalculation. Up until this point, the emperor had not been directly involved in policy decisions for centuries, and the Tokugawa shogunate had always maintained a very firm line that it was the master of policy, not the throne. Of course, that was couched in the language of subservience and easing the imperial mind and all that stuff, but everyone knew what it really meant. Boy almighty, did opening this can of worms really backfire. Not only did Hotta Masayoshi politically empower the imperial throne by bothering to ask at all, he was then unable to get Komei to actually agree to the new treaty. The emperor repeatedly refused to even consider it, and was particularly vociferous himself that Hyogo should under no circumstances be opened to foreign trade. Hotta Masayoshi was forced to resign in disgrace. After some dithering, the other advisors for the shogun selected another of their number, Ii Naosuke, the daimyo of Hikone, as the new Tairo. Ii was a bit more clear-headed, if rather indelicate, about what to do. The emperor's position did not matter. The shogun made these decisions, and so Ii Naosuke told the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu to just sign the treaty. Ieyasu did in July of 1858, but then there was one more setback. Just a few weeks after the signing, the sickly shogun died, probably as a result of a cholera epidemic that racked Edo after foreign merchants brought the disease to Japan. Once again, the shogunate was leaderless, or at least without a leadership figurehead, during a critical period, and to make things worse, Ieyasu had no children, and thus no obvious heir to pop on the throne and get things settled. And while all this was going on, and by the way, the Bakufu kept Ieyasu's death secret for over a month to avoid demoralizing its followers, things in Kyoto started to go haywire. After his recommendations were ignored and the Harris Treaty was signed anyway, Emperor Komei had been furious and threatened to abdicate, which would trigger another succession crisis because his only potential heir was a 5-year-old boy prince. He was convinced not to by a pro-Tokugawa noble and advisor named Kujo Hisatada, who told Komei the Bakufu would send someone to explain the whole thing and talk things through, and I'm sure there's a rational explanation for all of this. But no envoy came, and word reached Kyoto the Bakufu had signed 3 more unequal treaties modeled after the Harris Treaty instead, with the Dutch, British, and Russians. Homei was incensed. He sacked Kujo and threatened to resign again, and this was a huge step, circulated a letter to the Tokugawa Bakufu and members of the shogun's council he knew were sympathetic to him, condemning the treaties in no uncertain terms. This was a train wreck for the shogunate, and Inosuke would have to get a handle on it and reassert his authority as elder of the shogunate and ruler of the Bakufu. He did manage to do it, but I think it's fair to call his tactics a bit heavy-handed. First, he pushed through his preferred candidate to succeed Iesada as shogun. Since Iesada had been childless, the new one would be picked from the Shimpan, the branch families of the shogunate. There were 2 main candidates. The first was Hitotsubashi Yoshinobu, also sometimes called Tokugawa Yoshinobu, a young man descended from one of Inosuke's political rivals, and the second was Tokugawa Iemochi, a 12-year-old boy. No points for guessing which one the very decisive and not inclined to share power Inosuke wanted, and got. After putting the 12-year-old Iemochi onto the shogun's throne, Inosuke set about bringing the imperial court back under control. He dispatched one of his allies, Manabe Akikatsu, to Kyoto. Manabe arrested several of the nobles who had advised Emperor Komei for giving bad advice in encouraging the emperor to do something so foolish as disagree with the shogunate, and restored Kujo Hisatada as the emperor's chief advisor. And then Inosuke went about securing his power by going after anyone else he suspected of having conspired with the anti-treaty faction in Kyoto around the emperor, or in Edo, among the corridors of power. The resulting period in history is called the Ansei Purges, so called because 1858 was the 5th year of the Ansei era, a name that, somewhat ironically, literally means serene government. And I suppose removing your political opponents from office, placing them under house arrest, or in some cases having them killed, is technically a method to bring about serene government, to be fair. The Ansei Purges tend to loom large in the memory of the Bakumatsu, the final years of the Tokugawa period, largely because several of the prominent figures of the period, or their relatives or teachers, were among those targeted. For example, one of the few people executed during the purge was Yoshida Shoin, a samurai and intellectual from Choshu Domain in western Honshu. Yoshida had lived a colorful life. Influenced by his teacher, a rangakusha, or scholar of Western ideas, named Sakuma Shozan, Yoshida had tried to smuggle himself out of Japan on Commodore Perry's flagship during the Commodore's second trip to Japan to try and study the secrets behind Western superiority. He did not succeed in convincing Perry to take him along, and so was returned to shore and placed under house arrest by Choshu Domain. While under house arrest, he took it upon himself to open a private academy that taught the same Mitogaku Neo-Confucian philosophies we talked about before. Many of the future movers and shakers of early imperial Japan would attend that school. After the Harris Treaty, Yoshida, incensed at the shogun's disrespect of the emperor's wishes, would head to Kyoto and try and assassinate a Bakufu official. The plot was foiled, and Yoshida was executed. Because of the prominence of many of his students, Yoshida's death and the purges in general are often portrayed as this act of brutal tyranny. However, I do have to say the total body count was honestly not that high. Maybe a few hundred people were punished in total, and only a fraction of those were executed. By comparison, the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution killed tens of thousands in a comparable span of time. Still, Inosuke's clampdown was a bit of a political miscalculation, not because of his punishments, but because he underestimated the resolve of his opponents. Clearly, his notion was that he could cow opponents of his policies, and the Bakufu more generally, into submission with some public crackdowns. Instead, opposition to the shogunate began to galvanize into a new form. If Inosuke succeeded in quelling opposition among the daimyo, at court, and in Edo Castle itself, that was good for him, but it wasn't the only source of anti-Bakufu resentment. Particularly among the lower ranks of the samurai class, there was growing anger. The system had been failing them for a while now. Stipend cuts, no opportunities for advancement, And now the shogun, who was supposed to be a barbarian subduing general, that's what the name literally means, was instead getting pushed around by barbarians and defying the emperor in the offing. It would have been infuriating regardless, but particularly among lower samurai, ideas of kokugaku and mitogaku had strong currency. The focus on loyalty to the emperor had the peculiar effect of flattening out other parts of the social hierarchy, which seemed a lot less important if you framed everyone as loyal servants of the imperial throne, the service of which also could potentially open up long dreamed for opportunities to advance socially. And so, among this social group in particular, we see the startling growth during these years of a movement we call imperial loyalism. And here I will turn to the fantastic words of Marius Jansen, whose language in defining the movement is, I think, far better than mine could ever be. Jansen defined loyalism as, quote, conventional Confucian values as modified by the needs of Japanese feudalism. Duty, above all to a higher political calling, was superior to family considerations and responsibility. Loyalty was the mark of the good warrior, and since Japanese feudalism was strongly familialistic in thought, loyalty and filial piety, loyalty to your parents, were one. They reinforced the demands of duty. In the armory of the fighting man, these qualities outweighed others of humanity and trustworthiness in secondary situations and relationships. The Mito scholars whose work and attitudes colored the thinking of 19th century loyalists had focused on parts of the Confucian tradition which rationalized and moralized these ethical demands. In particular, it was the phrase of Taigi Meibun, the highest duty of all, which was central to the Mito teaching. In the eyes of these loyalists, nothing could be further from the ideal image of the emperor and court than the years after 1860, when impure foreigners forced their way upon the sacred shores because of the vacillation of an intervening bakufu. The shogunate's political position, however anomalous, had been defensible so long as it protected the court, but when its weakness could be shown to cause the emperor grief, it would inevitably be seen as an immoral usurpation. At such a time, the highest duty of all would dictate steps to correct the situation even if they were taken in defiance of conventional duty and discipline. And that's a heady ideological cocktail, and it will take us to some interesting places, but we'll have to wait for that until next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Cat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time for the next stage in the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate.